Well, we'd like to welcome you to our series of podcasts produced by OBI Foundation. And for those of you that are new to OBI or bioesthetics, we hope that this series of episodes will help you get a bit of an understanding of what bioesthetic dentistry really is and whether or not you might be interested in pursuing it. I have been involved with OBI, which is a nonprofit foundation overseeing teaching institutes around the world. I was president of the board for 11 or 12 years. I'm currently director of education for the foundation.
My name is Bernhard. What brought me to this organization is actually the fact that I wanted to do a better job.
Mm-hmm.
And what caught my attention was just the fact that biology and the way our chewing system operates was something that I hadn't heard before. I am a technical director of OBI, and we're doing this teaching together for many, many years, almost 2 decades, and it has been an exciting journey. So I'm more than happy to be here and do these podcasts together with you.
Well, I think maybe a good starting point would be going back in time to where dentistry really got its roots.
Right.
And, believe it or not, it's not that old a profession, really. It's although things were done to people's mouths and teeth, for thousands of years, the profession really only kind of sprung out of what used to be referred to as Barber-Surgeons.
Right, yeah.
And those guys cut your hair and pulled your teeth out, I guess.
Yeah, they were quite responsible for a lot of stuff.
So that's, believe it or not, the wellspring of the profession of dentistry. But, in the early part of the 1900s, we had some developments and some individuals who helped create what might be referred to today as the modern era of dentistry. Although when we look back, it wasn't that modern, but there was a guy that came onto the scene named G.V. Black,
Mm-hmm.
who really was the father of the principles that we still use today in a lot of restorative kinds of procedures, filling teeth and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And he laid out a number of sort of guidelines that I believe, many of which are still taught in dental schools to this very day.
Yeah.
And so that kind of elevated who was doing what in the profession. But those days, there weren't very many options for people
Exactly.
when it came to having trouble with their mouths.
Yeah.
And that was in large part because there weren't that many materials available to restore or replace missing teeth.
Yeah.
I think really the only 2 materials that were available for fixing teeth were gold, cast gold or gold foil.
Right.
And then after that, mercury amalgam came along. Mm-hmm. So those 2 materials were kind of the limit of what could be done.
Yeah.
So as a result of that, and other factors, I'm sure, many people ended up over the course of their lives losing their teeth.
Yeah, I guess that was a standard. It's safe to say.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of people would be safe to say.
Yeah.
And of course, as they lost their teeth, they needed to be able to continue to eat. So the whole field of prosthetic dentistry or replacing teeth with dentures came out of that need. And once again, the materials that they had to be able to use for constructing dentures were somewhat crude and limited. I mean, I think there's a story, I'm not sure if it's a myth or not, but George Washington had dentures that were carved out of wood.
He couldn't eat with them. No,
should just.
It was basically just for the public, but he couldn't even talk with it.
No. unfortunately, some other things came along. But in the 1920s, when resins were
Yeah,
developed,
but before that, we had this hard rubber.
right,
You know?
vulcanite.
That's exactly right. I think it was sometime during 1850s, about, when it got introduced or developed, but it was an organic material. But that was about the time when things really started changing, because if you were to lose your teeth, it was like either or. It was like black and white, so to speak. You either had the teeth extracted, and then you would, have no teeth, and then with this new material, there were, for the very first time, really restorative, if you want to call it that way, solutions available.
And so a lot of people obviously had limitations on what they could eat and how well they could chew.
Right.
Undoubtedly, that would have had some negative effects on their digestion and so on. So, they had porcelain to make the teeth part of the denture, and they had this rubber material called vulcanite to make the bases, which maybe didn't fit great, but
no, you couldn't expect that simply because they didn't have impressions material as we know them today, and so there were a lot of limitations, and like you said, you couldn't expect that the fit was there, and basically it was also more an aesthetic component than really functional. A functional component. Yeah.
Now, I think the reason it's important to kind of talk about this is that something happened later in the course of history that I think was a mistake, and we'll get into that. But it came out of the struggle that dentists had in creating some kind of dentures that would stay in place and allow some degree of chewing function, where the denture wouldn't be dislodged or come out of the mouth. And so there were some things that, through, I suppose, trial and error over the years, that they arrived at, that dentures needed to have more or less a flattened kind of morphology to the teeth. They needed to have certain aspects of how the teeth meshed together during chewing, so that there wouldn't be leverage on one side of the denture that would dislodge it.
Yeah, the fit of these dentures were poor, and somehow they tried to come up with technical solutions again, to address that.
Right.
And what I see is that the whole focus on basically dentures influenced very much the biomechanical understanding of how now I use a term, masticatory system, or a chewing system, basically works and operates. And all those findings basically led to certain conclusions, and these conclusions influenced the development of a lot of concepts that were later, though materials were developed that weren't available back then, were applied to those materials. And up until this day, the biomechanical understanding of our chewing system has not really significantly changed.
Yeah, I think that there has been a blind spot with regards to that.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think it was Stollard back in 1920 something, who first described some work that he had done on the movement of the mandible during function, which in those days pretty much applied to design and construction of dentures.
Right.
But some of that information carried forward, and he was, on a certain part of the right track in heading us in the right direction. But fast forward to the sort of 1940s and 50s, when, as you say, new materials had become available.
Acrylic, for example.
Right. So
Yeah.
resins were being used more and more.
Yeah.
And as a result of more preventive techniques that the profession had adopted, more people were keeping their teeth for longer.
Yeah,
And
toothbrushes
so-
came up.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go.
And because of that, then more emphasis was placed on the restorative procedures and techniques for teeth, as opposed to just how are we going to make dentures fit and stay in the mouth. And this is where I think this gap in thinking occurred, because as the birth of so-called gnathology, or the science of how the jaws function, occurred, the ideas of how to make the teeth work against each other were carried over from dentures.
Well, you bring up a very interesting point from my point of view, and that is, I mean, if you what you just covered are approximately 40 years, in time, so 4 decades. And so imagine that you come at some point to a conclusion that, wow, this stuff is 40 years old, and we want to question everything these guys did. That's usually not how it happens, So what you do is you rely upon that knowledge, but you would be far, far outside if you would say at that point, hey, let's just revisit everything, and throw it out the window. That's not how science usually works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of a weird twist, I guess.
Yeah.
And so many schools of thought in terms of reconstruction of the bite or restoring multiple teeth relied on some of those outdated ideas, if you will, that no one had really thought to go back and question.
Yeah.
And as a result, I think the advancement of how we can create dental restorations that are compatible with an individual's chewing system and that will last and provide service for a long period of time, that was inhibited by these wrong thinking. So if I guess we could fast forward a little bit to some of the other contributors.
Yeah.
We could talk a little bit about some of the other individuals. There was a fellow named Posselt who I think even today maybe some of his writings are studied in dental school curriculums, and he described an envelope of motion, if you will. That's what he called it, of the border movements of the human mandible. And he also looked at the functional movements of the human mandible, that is to say, how the jaw moved during chewing function, and what were the influences of how that jaw moved in function. So he was kind of one of the first people to introduce the idea that the shapes and the interaction of the teeth, the shapes on those teeth, would dictate how that person moved their jaw when they were chewing.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is also a piece of information or thinking that was largely ignored by a lot of people in dentistry as time went on.
Yeah.
But I think he did make some contributions that were very valuable. And then as time went on and new bits of technology were developed, there were people like Charlie Stewart, and beyond that, Lundin and Gibbs, who did some amazing research on being able to reproduce human jaw movements in order to analyze and also design restorations.
Yeah, I think it is worth at some point to do a separate podcast on those developments, because they're amazing. And I mean, their approach was something where I think was revolutionary in the sense that they were trying to find out what is our reference, And so I think this term reference really will become very, very important for our conversations because, of course, reference refers to a distinction between what is functional or positive, if you want to, healthy, versus what is pathology.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's probably worth an entire episode.
Yeah.
Which will come in the future.
Right.
But yes, what is your reference is a very good question to ask, because for many people involved in the dental profession, whether they sort of are aware of it or not, their reference is pathology.
Yeah.
And if you have that in your mind, let's say, for instance, you're only ever looking at people's mouths, dentitions that have some degree of wear on the enamel.
Yeah.
You may not actually even recognize the big difference between a worn dentition and an unworn natural dentition.
Mm-hmm.
And so your reference might be kind of skewed.
Yeah.
And it is important to really consider what reference you're going to use as you kind of construct these concepts of the best way of approaching helping people restore function to their mouths.
Yeah. So I think it is safe to say that these three doctors, dentists actually, Landin, Gibbs, and Dr. Lee, were probably the first ones who actually were seeking for a reference. And there is another term that comes up in my mind, and that is biologic or biology. And then if you want to take it a step further, it is like I indicated before, what is actually really considered to be healthy, and how do we know whether this is healthy or not? And that becomes a very, very central question, and that's actually the path that I think in these days now, where we have all these diagnostic tools available compared to 100 years ago, it might allow us to have a very different look at all those findings 100 years ago and compare them, whether the biomechanical understanding that they had in these days actually can still hold up with reality in these days.
Yes, I think you're right. And that's something that we're going to get to in a few minutes, are some of these new technologies that would allow us to do that in a very easy and accurate way.
Yeah.
But doctors Lee and Landin and Gibbs did some amazing work to be able to actually reproduce in real time the movement that a person could make with their mandible and movements that they made during function. And they actually had them chewing different kinds of food. And I mean, this is back in the 60s.
Yeah, so that's amazing, isn't it?
They had a computer, but apparently it filled an entire room.
Yeah.
And it needed a lot of energy just to keep it cool. Yeah. But they did it. And out of all of that came a new understanding, really. And Dr. Lee, who is basically the grandfather of bioesthetic dentistry, he was involved in that research, but he started to think about ways that he could bring that to the profession in a way that wouldn't be onerous or expensive or time consuming. Mm-hmm. And so he developed a system of articulators and jaw movement tracking devices under the name Panadent.
So our articulator, just to reference that for the audience, is basically a device that allows a clinician to simulate the movements of the lower jaw, or as we call it, the mandible, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And although articulators came onto the horizon way back when, they became more and more sophisticated through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and arrived at a place where they could actually reproduce very accurately an individual's jaw movements, which had a lot of advantages in terms of making an analysis and understanding the source of the problem, if you will, that an individual might present with. Um, and so the articulator is a device that, as you say, allows us to basically in our hands hold a copy of the chewing system of that person. And we're able to look at it from any angle. We're able to make any sort of measurements we want of teeth or of height of jaws, any kind of thing that we need to know. And so that has been the standard in restorative dentistry for decades now.
Yeah.
However, things are changing, are they not?
Yeah, that is right. And you know, while I was listening, I thought it is actually really interesting that we had in the 60s and maybe even in the early 70s such a strong movement, you know, probably worldwide in dentistry, to find out and understand better about our chewing system. A lot of articulators, devices again, to simulate jaw motion, you know, were developed during these years. And it was in the center, if you will, of state-of-the-art dentistry, that you would learn about this stuff, you know, that you would know about it, and that you would basically start diagnosing. And that is something that I feel like in these days, though we were far advanced in terms of technology, you know, this has really gotten to the background, and that is something that is not a positive development in any shape or form.
I think that's a very astute comment, Bern, because we can get too sidetracked by technology.
Yeah.
It's a very important tool for us, but we have to remember the as we say in OBI, the three serious questions that must be addressed. The first one being, what is happening?
Yeah.
You know, what do we see? What can we observe?
Right.
What does the patient refer us to in terms of their problem? And when we understand all of what is happening, then the second question comes to mind, which is, why is it happening?
Yeah.
And that really gets down to the nuts and bolts of diagnosis.
Yes.
If we're unable to answer the why, then we can't even hope to answer the third question, which is, what do we do about it?
Yeah.
And I think in large measure, the why question has been ignored or put in the back burner, as you say,
right,
in a rush to get to a solution.
Yeah.
To answer the third question. And as a result, it's a prescription for failure.
I think you make a really valid point. And, you know, when I think about my own career, what brought me actually to this profession, I think it applies to you and a lot of other colleagues that I know and you know, is actually really that question. I mean, when you start as a young professional, you know, isn't that the driving force? You want to do a good job, and you want to help people. You know, I don't want to put it too high, but I mean, this excitement about doing so to speak the right stuff. You know,
Sure.
That should be in the center. I mean, you want to do good, and I really feel like this should be reinforced, and part of that is why we're here today.
I think so, because that's a central aspect of our message at OBI.
Yeah.
And if we truly want to do the very best for our patient, then we need to be able to answer those three questions. And we need to understand what it is. What is our reference?
Yeah.
Do we want to use Optimum Health as our model or our reference?
Yeah.
Or are we prepared to use some level of degeneration as our reference? So at OBI, of course, we take the position that we need to use Optimum Health as a reference point.
Yeah.
And that would be what our objective would be in helping an individual who hasn't been lucky enough to stay healthy. And, you know, the curriculum that we've designed at OBI is a staged sort of multi-level process where we can guide the student, be a dentist or a technician, through the stages of, okay, gathering what records we need to make an accurate diagnosis.
Yeah.
Those records are going to help us, first of all, answer that first question,
Yeah.
what is happening here? And then they're also going to help us with answering the second question, why is it happening?
Right.
If we don't know why, then we don't really know what to do about it.
Well, you know what? Sorry to interrupt there, but you make an interesting point, because when you ask this question, what is happening, immediately you're going to compare that with your knowledge, and this is your reference. So I think it is important to go back in time to understand. Based on what we discussed so far, what is the history of dentistry, and which conclusions were drawn from certain findings, and what kind of biomechanical understanding that caused at the end of the day, it always resulted into more or less either strong convictions or did I say that right?
I think so.
Okay. Good.
Yeah, strong convictions based on your understanding of what your reference is.
Exactly. So why don't we dive a little bit into the history of those so-called occlusal concepts?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the meat of it, maybe. It helps to highlight the different types of understanding of what's involved in a successful restoration, if you will.
Yeah.
And there has been an evolution,
right,
that ultimately started with removable dentures.
I just meant to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And progressed through what different people were thinking would be an ideal setup of the contacts between the upper and the lower teeth when someone closed their teeth together. Maybe that seems a little like splitting hairs, but it isn't. And the concepts have gone through a remarkable evolution. Like, I think back in the 60s, a guy named Payne and Lundeen, maybe, they were sort of arriving at this idea that between the back teeth, when somebody closed, there should be somewhere around 58 contacts.
Yeah, even more. At some point we were at 80.
Well,
more than 80.
Yeah, it went up from there because when P.K. Thomas and Charlie Stewart got into the argument, I think it went up to 80 something.
Yeah.
And that was mainly because they had developed this idea that each cusp on a tooth, each bump, if you will, should have a tripod of contacts, 3 contacts on the various sides of that cusp. Well, when you start adding up 3 contacts per cusp, you got up to way over 80. And the idea behind all of this, as we understand it today, is that they were trying to arrive at a concept that would provide the maximum stability.
Yeah, I think, David, it is important to try to create a direct connection between the, say, late 1800s and, as we discussed before, what was available there in terms of restorative solutions. And we were talking about, it's either that a tooth needed to be extracted or not. So if you were losing teeth, then, long story short, you would end up with a denture over the course of a couple of years, and so now you would have a denture. And I'm thinking that back in those days, those researchers, if you want to call them this way, or dentists, who were trying to decipher the human chewing system, they were basically trying to come up with a reference. I'm going back to that term, reference. And the question is, what do you consider as being the reference when you draw your conclusions from? And so that must always be something that the majority or the researcher considers to be healthy. And it is with all these years in between, of course, very hard to tell what was their basis that they were starting from. Going back to that question that you said, what is happening? What is my observation? And so if you take that then and say, people were losing teeth, and now we had to come up with a restorative solution based on dentures. You were facing certain problems because you didn't have these impression materials, meaning the fit of these dentures wasn't giving. They were rather unstable when people tried to chew with these dentures, which meant then from a biomechanical standard, you probably had to come up with a solution that was, in a way, rather technically. And then that was transported, as we already discussed, further for 40, 50 years. And it was never really questioned to the extent whether you could apply the same biomechanical principles that you started using or applying on a denture onto a normal, meaning all teeth are still there, onto a human chewing system. And as we all know, that's exactly what happened. And that led them to various different so-called occlusal concepts where teeth were considered to be in an optimum function the more occlusal contacts they had. Yeah.
Which, as you say, stemmed from this thinking about how can we make a denture stay
exactly
stable in the mouth.
Right.
So that was really an unquestioned concept for a long time.
Yeah.
But later, as the years went on, different people became involved in that controversy, if you will.
Right.
And,
yeah, it was, for sure.
I think it was. There were big arguments over the course of many years on what would be ideal. And over time, different individuals contributed different thoughts.
Yeah, all kinds of dental societies, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the general kind of trend as things progressed was, well, we're going to need fewer contacts between the upper and the lower teeth. That, first of all, having 84 or 90 or whatever it might be was virtually impossible to actually create.
Yeah, who could control that?
Yeah. And then secondly, someone brought up the question, well, what are we trying to do with these contacts?
Yeah.
Because we really aren't trying to stabilize a denture anymore.
Yeah.
So what is it that we're trying to do? What is the purpose of those teeth touching each other?
Yeah.
And what we know now is that those teeth will remain in position because of muscle forces on them that neutralize each other. And as long as there is at least one point of contact between each opposing set of teeth, they won't super erupt or grow farther out of the socket, if you will.
Well, I could imagine that if you would talk about that on a dental event, you would probably experience some sort of resistance.
Still to this day, I think. Yeah, I think so. But I think enough time has gone by since Dr. Lee was introducing the concepts that he came up with that we know that we don't need 84 contacts, that we really only need one or two between each set of teeth that oppose each other, and that the purpose of those really has nothing to do with stability, but it has to do with recalibration in the brain, so the brain is constantly aware of where the jaw is.
Mm-hmm.
And the brain has these incredible mechanisms to gauge and move the mandible to within tenths of a millimeter over and over again in a very accurate, repetitive way.
Well, adding to that, I think what got a little bit out of focus is the fact that chewing is a learned behavior, right?
Well, that's just it. We have to get to that because it's not something you're born with.
Yeah.
You know, when you're born, you don't have teeth.
Yeah.
And your whole focus for getting nutrition is suckling.
Right, which is a completely different moving pattern for
Totally
the tongue,
different pattern.
the cheeks, and
Exactly.
everything, right?
In fact, we've come to know that those particular muscles that are activated for suckling
Yeah.
are innervated primarily by the seventh cranial nerve,
Mm-hmm.
which is called the facial nerve,
Yeah.
and that chewing movements that we develop once we get teeth are controlled primarily by the fifth cranial nerve, which is the trigeminal nerve.
Now, what does that cause?
What does that cause?
Yeah, I mean that transition or
Well,
that difference. Why is that important?
It's very important because different muscles are involved in the
Mhm.
movement of the jaw
Yeah.
for chewing versus suckling.
Right.
And the muscles, often referred to as the muscles of facial expression,
Mm-hmm.
are innervated by the seventh cranial nerve.
Yeah.
The muscles of mastication, which are the primary muscles for chewing, are innervated by the fifth cranial nerve. And when an infant grows teeth, from the moment those teeth come into contact with each other,
Mhm.
something magical happens.
Yeah.
It's like a switch.
Yeah.
And the brain starts to use the fifth cranial nerve
Mm-hmm.
for guiding and moving the mandible based on feedback that it's receiving
I just meant to
from
say.
the teeth contact.
So what you're basically saying is that as soon as we experience a tooth contact in our mouth, that actually initiates a feedback process, if you want to
Exactly.
put it that way, you know.
Exactly.
And then this is being processed in a certain area of our brain, and then activates certain muscles to contract or relax.
Yes.
Yeah.
And those movement patterns have been referred to as brain engrams,
Mm-hmm.
like a little program.
Oh, okay.
It's not a reflex because we weren't born with it,
Right.
but it's a learned pattern of movement that in the case of the chew
Yeah.
is very, very accurate.
Now, hold on. Does that not suggest that if you change the form, you also change the moving pattern?
In fact, that does.
Okay.
And that's a very important point to make, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because even as we watch the pattern of chewing in a child
Yes.
that has primary teeth only,
Yeah.
and then watch that pattern of chewing change
Yeah.
as they erupt permanent teeth, which
Yeah.
are much larger and sharper and steeper in their morphology,
Mm-hmm.
the pattern of chewing alters.
Now, well, if you allow me, I said a couple of minutes ago that we don't know what reference back in the days these people were using to come up with their biomechanical understanding. And if I draw a straight connection between then and what you are just saying, it is that we should be, to some extent, critical. I mean, I have full respect for their researchers and all the work and the effort that they put in. But what I'm saying is that if we want to, so to speak, clean the table as we started, and say, okay, what is going on? Like, what is happening? It would be good to have that reference. And
Sure.
we don't know what kind of reference these people were looking at back in those days. In other words, what kind of form they were looking at. And so this seems to become the center of this whole discussion that we are having here.
Yes, it does, because we have to recognize that the interaction of the teeth, the shapes of those teeth,
Yeah.
dictates those brain engrams, the pattern of movements.
Uh-huh.
And so if we look at someone who's had the misfortune of wearing down their teeth
Yeah.
severely, and they're left with quite flat chewing surfaces,
Right.
perhaps even exposed dentin layer of the teeth,
Yeah.
and we measure how their jaw moves during function, during chewing,
Yeah.
it will be very different than if we do the same measurement on somebody who has preserved the natural shapes that those teeth developed with.
Yeah.
And therefore, the conclusion that we can come to is if we want to help someone whose chewing system is failing,
Mm-hmm.
our reference needs to be optimum health natural, unworn shapes that will guide the mandible in a way that nothing becomes overloaded.
Well, now I'm playing the devil's advocate, if you will, and that is, I, from my own experience, when I discuss these topics, with other professionals, I always run into this argument. Hold on, this is adaptation, and so I think it is critical to look and ask, okay, what is adaptation? Well, first of all, what's the definition of adaptation? And then, is there a certain point where we don't speak about adaptation anymore, but we are speaking about pathology? Mm-hmm. And so, from my experience, I would think you could say there are currently two existing models in global dentistry. And the first theory, I call it that way. Mm-hmm. Maybe people will look at it and say, hold on, this is not a theory. But for the purpose of our conversation, I would leave it like that, stay open and say, hey, you know what? There are two models. And one is, two models to explain the loss of hard tissue, to explain that probably a little bit more precise. When we're looking at a tooth or a tooth anatomy, we're basically talking about two different tissues. A healthy tooth or a genetic tooth is covered with the visible part with enamel.
That's right.
And the inside is dentin. These are two very different materials and have a different structure. So the enamel is very rigid, very wear resistant. Right. And then you have the dentin, which is a very soft material. And at that point, I always think back in time in my youth when I started skiing. So I'm living, or I was raised very close to the Bavarian Alps, and skiing was sort of natural. I guess very similar to living in Calgary or growing up in Calgary. Yes. And so back in those days, I had wooden skis. So there were no edges. Mm-hmm. And wood was an excellent material because it had this big or a good elasticity, but it didn't have a lot of resistance against torsion.
Right.
And so when I was going downhill and I tried to work on edges, there was no such thing. And the next evolutionary level, if you will, was there were metal edges. And those metal edges were screwed on those skis, Sure enough, with the elasticity of the wood, sooner or later, those metal edges would fall off. Yeah. And then later, fast forward, they came up with a solution where you had a so-called compound ski, which was basically a wooden core covered and with several layers of resin or
resin and metal.
Resin and metal, thank you. And what wasn't available back in those days were the same kind of bindings as you have in these days, which are adjustable. So I would get my skis. I know this sounds like what has that to do with dentistry, but I'm getting there. So my skis were usually already skis that my older brother, or my older sister would have already used for a couple of years. So my feet were smaller, and what you had to do was you had to remount the bindings, mm-hmm. which left a hole in the ski. And this is actually where I'm headed to. And so now these holes were never filled up. And guess what? When snow melts, water gets into these holes, and it has an impact, a negative impact on the wooden core. So where's the relationship between my example here and the tooth? Well, I mean, guess what? If you cut off the enamel layer and the dentin get exposed, we all know what's going to happen at some point. The dentin, since it is softer, will be exposed to all kinds of negative substances, bacteria. And so you couldn't consider this tooth as a healthy tool.
No.
And so if you take that image then there is only a small range where you could still say where is still a functional adaptation. And there's a term for it. If I'm correct, it is attrition. Is that right?
Attrition refers to the wear of enamel, yes.
Yeah.
And adaptation, it can either be physiological or pathological.
Right.
And so
I think that's a good
what
point.
we're trying to make a point here is where is the line between a physiological adaptation of attrition on the enamel of the teeth versus pathology.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to what is your reference?
Right.
Because if your reference is unworn, natural, genetic shapes, then no amount of attrition is physiological.
Yeah, and I get that a lot of people from a professional standpoint, because they have been educated in a different way, would look at that and reject that idea. But let me just summarize one more time what you and I are just discussing. So I said there is the first theory that says wear is actually the optimum adaptation to a chewing system to provide the best function possible. Whereas the other theory says, hold on, we're looking at every individual tooth and say the structure of that tooth is being damaged by wear. This is dysfunctional. We don't want that. So these are entirely
very different concepts.
Yeah.
And so I think it's easier for a lot of the profession to look at someone who is exhibiting signs of wear or attrition and say to themselves, well, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
And, how am I going to actually fix it anyway?
Yeah.
Or what could I possibly do to stop it from progressing?
Yeah.
Those are difficult questions to answer. And so it's much easier, more common for a professional to say, well, we'll just keep an eye on this.
Yeah.
But it does progress.
Yeah.
And some people progresses more rapidly than others. Sometimes it's accompanied by other clusters of symptoms and signs. But it is definitely, in my opinion, a sign of a system that isn't in harmony and balance. It's going to wear itself out.
Now, I think it is interesting to raise the question, well, is there any, proof is a big word, but is there anything that would give us a hint whether or not this second theory of where is dysfunctional and is actually a reason for concern, whether there is any indication that this theory could have some truth to it. And from a pure biomechanical standpoint, one more time, what we do know is that, wear means that you need, similar like a knife. Let me allow me to draw a conclusion or a comparison there. If you have a sharp knife, which I would refer to a genetic morphology, that means that you have the least amount of force being applied to something that you want to cut in two parts. Now, if you take a tooth, the main task of a tooth is actually also to break whatever food you're talking about into smaller pieces. So if you have a dull knife, the effort and the force that you have to apply to cut whatever it is, a good steak, into smaller pieces increases. And we all have experienced that. And the same thing applies onto teeth, because if you and there's actually proof to that. We have a slide which we will include here to the audience, which shows that yes, force is also increasing. But the point that I'm trying to make is what impact has a worn tooth on the tissues which are also involved. So I'm talking about ligaments, bones. Can you say something about that?
Well, I think it's important to say something about that because, as you say, a dull knife takes more force, but it also takes more time.
Mm-hmm.
And force times time is work. So
Sure.
let's say that there's more work involved,
Yeah.
which in the case of teeth, I mean, it wouldn't simply be just one tooth, but it would be a general pattern of wear. Then more work is involved to properly masticate food.
Yeah.
So what is the implication of that? Are there effects on the other tissues? For instance, the periodontal tissues that support the root of the tooth, the ligament, periodontal ligament,
Yeah.
the bone that is attached to that ligament will suffer over time if there's
And we
too
know
much.
that, right?
We do know that.
Yeah.
We see that happen.
Yeah.
Also, the joints of the jaw can be overstressed
Mm-hmm.
and develop derangements or mechanical changes inside the joint that can lead to things like limited function, limited ability to open,
Mm-hmm.
pain,
Mm-hmm.
headaches. So a myriad of different things can happen as a cascade of events as a result of overload
Mm-hmm.
in the dentition.
Mm-hmm.
And so OBI, in their approach to teaching how to answer those three questions,
Mm-hmm.
uses as a reference a natural genetic system
Mm-hmm.
that is not overloaded.
Yeah. And OBI, sorry, David, just for the audience, stands for what again?
Okay, so what does OBI mean or stand for?
Right.
I'll give you the real words. Orognathic Bioesthetics International refers to OBI, which is a nonprofit foundation that oversees teaching institutes in 6 different countries around the world.
Mm.
So the term OBI was developed by Dr. Charles Wold,
Mm-hmm.
who actually took over the teaching responsibilities from Dr. Lee back in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And although it probably isn't as widespread a term in the profession, doesn't ring
You mean orognathic?
orognathic or OBI.
Yeah. Oh, I see.
The bioesthetic, the B part of OBI is what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
And it isn't necessarily a philosophy.
Uh-huh.
It's more, I would say, principle-driven,
Yeah.
based on a reference
Yeah.
of optimum natural health
Mm-hmm.
that is also driven by solid scientific research.
Yeah.
So it is a method of teaching, but an understanding of how the chewing system actually works and a way to answer those questions. What is happening? Why is it happening?
Yeah.
And what to do about it. Now, today, we can't ignore development of digital technologies that we have at our disposal today,
Yeah.
and how those have impacted and continue to impact what we do. So I think it's important to recognize that digital photography was one of the first digital technologies that came along that was useful for us in
Mhm.
dentistry.
Mm-hmm.
And then very shortly after that, digital radiography came along, which is linked to digital photography, but that became extremely important in the diagnostic process because of computerized tomography that is applied to digital radiography, which really means 3-dimensional X-rays.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Well-
that's very, very beneficial in terms of diagnostic records.
I mean, for every kind of, I would say technological progress, it is always good if you're capable to visualize. I mean, in all kinds of medicine or all various disciplines, the technologies that you're referring to had a major impact on the understanding. I mean, if you just think about MRIs and CT scans, for example, heart CT scans open up a totally new way to diagnose heart diseases, and so yeah, I agree with these technologies. We can now look at movement patterns, for example, and learn so much more directly from the real patient and see effects. Like you said, I mean, we were at some point referring to chewing as a learned behavior. So now you receive dental restoration, and guess what? If this dental restoration does not comply with certain functional requirements, it will cause harm.
Sure. Yes, and so some of these technologies have really advanced our understanding of what's really going on, how the chewing system works.
Yeah.
Another would be 3D optical scanning,
Yes.
which is basically taking over the clinical part of making impressions.
Yes.
It's more accurate, it's easier, it's just a more elegant way to reproduce someone's teeth and jaws.
Yeah.
And then really, I think probably the latest big important development in the digital realm is 3-dimensional jaw movement tracking, which allows us to see even more what's going on functionally.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing combined with new, more powerful software allows for us to replicate an individual pretty much right on a screen. We can see them from any angle we choose.
Well, I can tell you firsthand, I mean, I started my career a couple of moons ago and that was completely analog. So everything was basically manual. You were creating restorations using, back in the days, a Bunsen burner. And then later on, it's really, really sophisticated. You had a so-called electric waxer, basically a tip that was heated up. And then you would dip that tip into wax, and drop by drop, you would build maybe 28 teeth. And this was an enormous task. Sure. It required a completely different skill set. But nevertheless, you're right, when you're using designing software, you can so much more explore and investigate the consequences, simulate the consequences of any form alterations, sometimes even during the process of designing.
Sure.
And you learn so much about what we are discussing here. Form, I think we haven't said that. Form follows function, and function follows form.
Yes.
Right?
That's exactly right. And form follows function is one we always hear.
Yeah.
And of course that's true.
Yeah.
If we look at the evolution of various creatures in the animal kingdom, for instance, what was available for them to eat and get nutrition over the course of millennia dictated the form of their chewing systems.
Yeah.
But what we know also is that the form dictates the function in terms of the pattern of movement. Yeah. And this is what we're seeing with the application of some of these amazing digital technologies, absolutely proven out.
I can tell you today already that I'm really, really very much looking forward to one of our future episodes where we talk about evolution. What I meant to say still regarding bioesthetic dentistry, I remember I had a conversation back in the days. I met Bob Lee when he was coming to Germany way back. And so I'm a German, sorry. So I was always very suspicious, and I thought, oh, well, those Americans, of course, aesthetics and aesthetic dentistry, and it's all about how you look. And so I started this conversation with him. This is really true. And I said, what does this term bioesthetic, what does that mean? Is this all about aesthetics? And he smiled and laughed and he said, no, this is a misconception. He said, basically, it's just an abbreviation because what it really is, biology. And that actually got me for the very first time really considering what this was all about. And he then continued and said, you know what, if you look at something that is healthy in nature, guess what? We experience that as being aesthetic.
Yeah.
And that's so right.
It is right. And I agree with you. The term bioesthetic is misleading
to some extent.
Because aesthetic takes up more room than the bio in the word.
Right.
But
it's just the other way around.
It should be, yeah.
Yeah.
Because if we get the biology right,
yes.
In other words, we've used as our reference.
Right. If we understood
Optimum
form in function.
Genetic
right?
form.
Yes.
Then the byproduct of that
is aesthetics. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And that got me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what hooked you.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that maybe the way to end our discussion today is to consider, okay, well, what does OBI utilize in the course of the education process for the students?
Yeah.
And given that we've just finished talking about some of these wonderful advantages that digital technology brings, we do encourage our students to make use of them, and we teach how they're applied in bioaesthetics through the course of the curriculum. It's not like it's a panacea. The beautiful part about all of this is that it's been proven to be absolutely the right way to go using analog methods.
Right.
But utilizing these digital technologies has moved us forward, I think, in terms of accuracy, precision, and predictability of outcomes.
Better than anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think we should probably leave it at that for today.
Yeah.
But I've enjoyed our little discussion.
Yeah, so did I. Thanks.
Well, thank you for joining us for today's discussion. And if you've enjoyed watching us, be sure to tune in again. Our next episode is going to be all about adaptation in the human chewing system. And also, if you really enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to see more of us as we walk you through what bioaesthetics is all about.